today's webinar, External Cause Codes for the Professional Feed Coder. And I want to introduce Karina Marcourt, that I never say quite right, I don't think, Karina, so you'll always have to correct me. But Karina is a senior consultant with Haugen Consulting Group, and she's got over 20 years of healthcare industry experience. She enjoys working with the coders and the physicians and building the relationships between those two worlds of documentation and coding. She's also a certified professional medical auditor, and she really works at sharing her knowledge and expertise while auditing and communicating those results and findings to coders and physicians. She's an awesome trainer, and I've worked closely with her for the last couple years in webinars and ILTs, as well as the web-based training. So she's just a gem and lots of knowledge. So at this time, Karina, I think I'm going to turn it over to you and let you kick us off.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Kathy. We're going to go ahead and get started, and we're going to EEK. We thought was appropriate since it is coming up on Halloween here. So let me introduce you to Boo. Boo is going to be our little guy that's going to be helping us through this webinar today. And again, don't be scared, that's just his name. So some of the things that we're going to cover today, we're going to talk about obviously external cause codes themselves, how to code them. I think sometimes this is thought of as one of those more difficult areas, is when to apply, when not to apply. What are some of the codes that have 7th characters to be added, and which ones are not? And then I'm going to give you some tips along the way as to how to even search for those terms as well. So we are going to be focused on Chapter 20 in your ICD-10 CM, whether you're using the books or you're using some type of an encoder. But these are the V, the W, the X, and the Y codes. This really is, it's a really big chapter in your ICD-10 if you're using that book. And again, the use of these codes has always, for many people, been deemed as, really super confusing. So I think one basic thing to remember is that those external cause codes, well, they're add-on codes. Those are the add-on codes that provide additional information about the circumstances of a patient's injury or their illness. The purpose of these codes is really to provide data for like injury research and evaluation of injury, like preventive strategies. These codes, they really include the cause, the intent, the place, the activity, and the status. And we're going to get into those in a little bit more detail as well. And of course, we're going to cover some guidelines along the way to help us out. So as you probably all know, there is no national requirement that mandates that we have to use the ICD-10 CM codes unless you have a provider or you're in a state that is subject to a state-based external cause code reporting mandate, or maybe you have a particular payer that is requiring you to report to them. But what is encouraged is, or the ICD-10 codes, I should say, are encouraged, highly encouraged, I should say, to voluntarily report them. And I'm going to tell you why that it's going to be important for that. So it really provides valuable data for injury research, like I mentioned earlier, and then preventive strategies as well for injury. So for example, if we're using these ICD-10 CM external cause codes, and then if we're able to go in and data mine, and that data shows a high incidence of injury due to like ATV accidents in a particular region, then perhaps you would get your local leaders together and they would perhaps develop kind of a more aggressive approach to ATV safety education. So just one example of how those can be important, and I'm going to show you some more as well. There are other entities that use these codes. So payers, of course, look at those. So particularly when they're making those determinations related to work comp claims. State legislators use these codes to improve safety laws. Members of the media often will use this information to inform the public. And then sometimes other state agencies, such as like the transportation departments and the elementary and secondary schools, might use them. And then health, we know that health and community advocates are using them as well. Sometimes individual organizations might use these codes to improve processes. So for an example, if there was an organization that noticed a high volume of like opioid overdoses, again, they could use that information and launch a community action program. You know, it's kind of a silly one, but if an organization notices a high volume of falls within like bathrooms, it may need to reevaluate kind of that bathroom design and safety features. So anyway, as you can see, it's used in a kind of a plethora of different types of administrations. One thing that it's just starting to be used in, and you may or may not have heard of some of these situations in the news, but external cause codes are starting to be used in the courtroom. So I don't know if you remember a year ago, it's been just about a year ago, there was a high profile case, and it had to do with the New Orleans Saints lineman Will Smith. So again, not sure if you heard of this, but it was back in around, I think it was around April of 2016. Well, this lineman from the New Orleans Saints, Will Smith, again, he was shot and he was killed in a road rage. And his wife was also injured. So Will actually passed away, and then his wife, Raquel, was injured. So afterwards, the person that actually killed him, I should say, he obviously was brought up on manslaughter charges and attempted manslaughter. And the gentleman, his name was I'll just call him Mr. Hayes. I mean, it's all public record, but his attorneys actually requested a hearing to argue that their client deserved a new trial based on the hospital having coded Raquel, so the wife's, injuries as the result of an accidental discharge of a gun. So, and according to the New Orleans Advocate, which is a publication, again, it's online, there were 3 employees of the hospital that treated Raquel Smith. They all testified during that hearing. The witnesses actually told the court that the codes from the attorneys, or the codes that the attorneys were referencing, was an external cause code indeed, but nothing about Raquel's injury supported the determination of accidental. So they basically testified that that code, or those codes, those external cause codes, were likely entered in error. So it turned out the request for a new trial was denied, and Mr. Hayes was eventually sentenced to, I think, around 25 years for manslaughter for killing Will Smith, and then I think another 15 years or so for the attempted manslaughter of his wife. But really, nevertheless, these codes are catching on, and they are being brought into the courtroom as well. So let's just go back and start with the external cause coding basics. So I'm not going to go into all of the guidelines, as you surely can open up those fabulous books of yours or your encoders and find them, but just some of the coding basics. You know, remember, these codes don't necessarily mean that they can only be coded with injury codes. They can be used anytime a condition is linked to an external cause that's in that documentation. They can be used with any code in the ranges A00 all the way to T88.9, and then they pick back up in those Z codes. The external cause codes used for length of treatment, so that's that, use that appropriate 7th character, and we're going to have just a friendly little review, you know, of what those 7th characters are and when they should be applied. They also tell you in your coding guidelines that you should use the full range. So use as many external cause codes as necessary, or don't use them. There's rules for when you won't use them as well. And we'll have a friendly reminder of those. External cause codes, remember, can never be that first listed diagnosis. Remember, we stated earlier that they are add-on codes. So we're going to put them as secondary codes. There are some external cause codes that are combination codes that identify like a sequential event that resulted in injury, so such as possibly a fall, which then results in striking against an object. So whenever you have that combination code, you can use the combination code, and then if it defines everything, you don't have to go out and seek the other external cause codes. The one thing I think, one of the important guidelines is no external cause code from this chapter is needed if that external cause and intent are included in a code from another chapter, and those are those T codes, so those poisoning by penicillins, you know, because you can choose whether it's accidental or all of those things. I want to say from the auditing perspective that, where I see most of the errors when I'm looking at coders audits or even some of the providers as well, where I see these codes applied on subsequent encounters when they should really only be reported on an initial encounter, and we're going to cover that as well. I think it's important that we always go back to the basics and read those guidelines so we know that we're applying these appropriately. So there is an external cause hierarchy that you'll find in your guidelines as well. And we have shown them to you in this pyramid. So the pyramid will show the hierarchy starting with codes for child and adult abuse will trump all other external cause codes. So if you start at the top, you can see that the child and adult abuse, if you have a code for that, that's going to trump. Then terrorism events, then the cataclysmic events, and boy, have we had several of those in our country lately, huh? And then the transport accidents, and then everything else underneath. So this is just a fun little slide showing you the hierarchy if your documentation, represents different types of events going on. Oops, lost my forward here. Alrighty, let's start to do a little bit of a deeper dive into that chapter 20. So here at Haugen, we like to try to make, education and learning fun. So we wanted to find an easy way to remember which codes begin with which letters, because it is a huge chapter. It's the V's, the W's, the X's, and the Y's. Well, this isn't a hard and fast rule, but in general, this is kind of what we came up with as a fun way to remember. You can remember that transport, or what we would call vehicle accidents, will start with a V. So many of the codes for accidents, such as the slipping, the tripping, the stumbling, and the falling, start with W, as in, what was I thinking? And then we have various external cause codes that begin with the letter X, but included in the X codes are codes for like exposure to smoke and fire and flame, and exposure to forces of nature. So get it? We use the X there. And then as for the Y codes, well, that's just for the rest of them. So hopefully that will help you when you're coding. As I mentioned earlier, we do have some external cause codes that are combination codes that account for what they call sequential events that result in an injury, sort of kind of like we talked before, like a domino effect. So here's an example on your screen, the W18.02XA. This code could be used if someone fell off of a toilet and then struck the wastebasket, which then resulted in an injury. It also has a 7th character extension, and just for a brief review, our 7th character extensions are those A for active, D, for what I call during the routine care or the healing, and then the S for the sequela. So the A is that initial counter, and that's used while that patient is receiving active treatment for that condition. The D is for that subsequent encounter when that patient has received active treatment of the conditions. They've already received it, and now they're receiving routine care for the healing or recovery. And I always call that during the healing phase. I'm a word association person, so that helps me. And then S for sequela, those are those complications or conditions that really are a direct result, of, what happened prior to. All right, I think that just brings us to booze benchmark number 1, Kathy.
Perfect. Okay, I'm launching the poll. You should see on your screen the first polling question of today's presentation. So what do you think? Which external cause code should be sequenced before the others? Is it terrorism, child and adult abuse, or transport accidents? So what do you think? Which one's at the top? Terrorism, child and adult abuse, or transport accidents? Oh my, you guys were fast. Wow, you guys are on the move today. We've got 100% who have already voted. All right, I'm closing, sharing the responses. And Karina, we've got 100% of our audience is saying it's child and adult abuse.
Well, they are absolutely correct. That child and adult abuse is at the top of the pyramid. So that is correct. Great job, everyone. All right, let's continue on here. So before we start really kind of diving into these codes, for those of you that are still using an ICD-10 code book, which I think most of us are, or we're using that, in conjunction with our encoders. But, remember, we always start in that index, and sometimes, we forget sometimes even where to find those. And remember, the index for external causes, it's separate from the index to the diseases and the injuries, and it's located after the table of drug and chemicals. So that's where you're going to find those. This is just a screenshot, of the first part of the index, and it really, again, was just a friendly reminder as to where to start, and that is to start in that index. You're going to notice, just like everything else, and when we start in our index, this doesn't show, the 7th character codes or beyond, or a lot of times even beyond the 3rd and the 4th character. So that's why you would always turn then and go to your coding and then find the correct code. All right, let's start diving in a little bit deeper. And as Boo is saying, how do I remember? How do I remember, where to start and what is what, and, all of those good things. So Boo is like to tell you, you can actually remember by asking yourself these 6 simple W questions. So if you do that, if you can understand the what, the why, the where, the when, the who, and then the how, then you're going to be able to capture all of the codes that are appropriate. So first, the what. That's the what happened. This will identify the cause, okay? And then why did it happen? That's the intent. Was it accidental? Did someone inflict injury on somebody else with an intent to harm them? Was the patient trying to hurt themselves? So there's your intent. And then, of course, where did it happen? And that gives you your place of occurrence. The how did it happen? That's kind of like the activity. What was the patient doing at the time? Were they working? Were they playing a sport? So if you ask, say, how did this occur, then you're going to get your activity code. Who? This is, the question that you ask in there for the status of the patient, meaning, is this someone who was injured maybe while they were landscaping, working, or perhaps serving in the military? So that who question is going to help you identify the patient status. And then finally, when. When did this occur? This is one of those important code assignments, because here, this is where you're going to apply those 7th characters, right? To say, when did it occur? Is it initial? And this is active treatment. Are we now in that, during that healing phase, or is this a sequela? So, all right. So let's get even deeper in the W. The first W that we just discussed was the what happened. Again, that's going to give us the cause. So this can be anything from a motor vehicle accident as a cause of an injury to a person, to, even somebody who might have been pecked by a chicken, or, as you can see on the slide, somebody that was burned by water skis that caught on fire. And I have to tell you, I have seen that happen. I was born and raised in Wisconsin, and if any of you know or have heard of Wisconsin Dells, we have the famous Tommy Bartlett water show there, and I actually saw somebody, they were jumping through a ring of fire, so to speak, on their water skis, and their water skis did catch on fire. So back when I was a kid, obviously we didn't have all of these external cause codes then, but if I saw that today, I could apply this code. So even some of those silly, silly codes that we think are silly, you know what? Some of us have actually witnessed them. All right, here's the intent, right? So let's take a look at some other possible intents of injuries that can be described by your external cause codes. So here's your intentional self-harm. So here's your X71 through X83. There's an example on your screen for you. And then you have the assault. So you're going to have the X92 through Y09. And remember, just another friendly reminder that where the intent is captured in the code, like in that table of drugs and chemicals, then you won't need to add that external cause code to capture this information since it's already been built in. So for example, you can see that T51.0X2A. where it talks about the toxic effect of ethanol. It was an intentional self-harm. So you have both of those informations already built into that code. Oh, there are so many codes. If you've ever coded for transport accident or vehicle accident, so that V00 through V99, the section itself, if you actually go through that, it's structured into 12 different groups. Those relating to like land transport reflect the victim's counterpart, the type of the accident, or the type of the event, I should say. The vehicle of which the injured person is an occupant is identified in the first two characters. So apparently that is seen as the most important factor to identify for prevention purposes, is what we've been told. And then a transport accident is one in which the vehicle involved, it must be moving or running or in use for transport purposes at the time of the accident. And that question has been asked often by coders, is what is that transport accident? So again, that vehicle must be moving, running, or in use for transport purposes at the time in order to use those transport codes. The definitions related to transport accidents themselves can really be found at the beginning of your chapter 20. They do include the definitions of the various types of vehicles and the accidents that are defined within this code set. There's also an important use additional code note here, so always remember to check for those. That additional code instruction note will tell us to also code for like airbag injuries, the type of the street or the road, you know, was a cell phone involved or other electronics at the time of the accident. So just a friendly reminder to look at those use additional code notes. Okay, so here's an example for you. So we have a 23-year-old patient who came in with a nasal and sternum fracture after they were injured by the airbag when it deployed into their face and their chest. He was driving a late model SUV when he rear-ended a semi-truck on I-25 here in Colorado, and unfortunately he was texting during the accident. So these are some code choices. So obviously you have your injury codes there, your fracture of your sternum and your fracture of your nasal bones. Then we have your W22 code. So there is the airbag code. We have the V54 code. There was a driver of the pickup truck, and then it was involved in a collision with a heavy transport vehicle. So that is him running into that semi-truck. It occurred on I-25, so we can capture that with a Y92 code there. And then, like I said, unfortunately, he was texting while driving, and we do have an activity handheld interactive Y93 code. So that is an example of how we could apply those external cause codes. All right, moving on to our place of occurrence. These are secondary codes for use other than the external cause codes. These codes are used to identify the location of the patient at the time of the injury, okay, or what other condition it might have been. This is that where, that W where code that we talked about. The place of occurrence is reported with category code Y92. And this category, oh my goodness, if you've spent any time in here, it has tons of specificity. These codes are listed after the cause and intent codes, okay? And also, generally, a place of occurrence code is assigned only once at that initial encounter for treatment. And that's why you won't see 7-character extensions for codes in that Y92, because it's not asking you for the active, the during the healing, or the sequela. There's just going to be the one code at the time of that initial encounter. This is also just to, you know, bring you in on some of the errors we see in coder and provider audits. That we see place of occurrence codes being assigned after that initial encounter. I mean, there is a rare occurrence where it could happen, and that would be like a scenario where they were brought into the hospital, and then maybe during their hospitalization, an additional place of occurrence can be assigned. So, you know, maybe they were in their bed and then they tried to get out of bed and then they fell, right, and then broke, you know, their collarbone or something. So it could happen, but it's not that common that we would use this on codes other than that initial encounter. Okay. Alrighty. Where? So let's take a look at some of the where codes. You know, for those of you that have joined, if you're coding for like a children's emergency room, you know, I bet you see kind of the elementary school place a lot as, you know, the where things happened on the playground maybe. For some of those, I don't know if you're in it from more of that rural area, but, you know, if we have injuries in the barn, we do have codes for that as well. And then we even have those that are garden, yard, you know, Y92. And I could go on because there are so many of these codes, but these are just some examples of the where codes that you can find in your ICD-10 CM. Oh my goodness, and then we have activities. Just when we thought there were a lot of codes for, you know, the where, again, we've got these activity codes. So activity codes are found in category Y93, and these are the codes that report what the patient was doing at the time when they were injured or they have that health condition, right? So these are similar to like those place of occurrence codes. These activity codes are only used during that first encounter for treatment, and only one code from category Y93 should be assigned for that visit, and that's per your guidelines, okay? Again, because these are only assigned on those initial encounters, you're not going to see, you know, those extension codes as well. So some of these activity codes, you can see we have walking and running, water and watercraft, ice and snow, exercising, computer technology, you know, if they got hurt playing a musical instrument, which I'm sure I can somehow manage to do. Personal hygiene. I mean, some of these are, you can let your imaginations go, and you can have some fun with some of these if you were making up your own scenarios. One other thing I want to make sure to tell you here on this slide is coding guidelines also tell us do not assign the Y93.9, which is that unspecified activity code, if no activity is stated. And I've seen that, you know, often again in audits where there isn't an activity stated anywhere in the documentation, so the coder or the provider has assigned this unspecified activity code. Guidelines say don't do it, okay? Let's take a look at some examples, just a few of your activity codes. And like we said, as we noticed on that previous slide, we have a plethora of them, but here's just a few examples. So we have activity bowling. So if that's where they were injured, baseball. I personally, again, with raising two boys that were baseball players through high school and also collegiate baseball players, both of them could have used this code many times as they were transported off to the hospital or the clinic. Basketball, you know, you can even have, there's even the Y93.81, you know, the activity refereeing a sports activity. So again, just you name the activity and I bet you can find it in the ICD-10 Chapter 20 area. Oh my, that also brings us to Boo's benchmark number 2.
Perfect. Okay. Here's our poll. On your screen you see the question. Activity codes should be assigned only once at the initial encounter for treatment. Is that true, false, or you don't know? So if you're in a classroom setting or a large group with some of your coworkers, ask them. We just like to have an answer from everybody just because I think it makes good discussion. So what do you think? True, false, or I don't know? Oh, perfect. All right. Karina, I'm closing, sharing the responses, and we've got 100% of everyone is saying it is true.
Well, that is absolutely correct. So that is super exciting. Yes, it is true. Activity codes are only used once at that initial encounter. And then just a little extra tidbit and friendly reminders, remember only one code also should be recorded from category Y93 as well. So great job, everyone. All right, let's move on to status. those status codes. There are 5 external cause status codes in category Y99. A single code from that category Y99 should be used with the external cause codes. And these status codes really indicate the status of the patient at the time the event occurred. Okay, we do have a coding guideline here that tells us that, you know, when we have that code from category Y99, it should be assigned for an encounter including an activity code. So we should be looking for that activity code. We also should assign a category for Y99 to indicate the work status or the person at the time the event occurred. So that status code really indicates whether the event occurred during a military activity, whether a non-military person was at work, whether an individual, like a student or a volunteer, was involved in a non-work activity at the time as well. And then there's we always have those other codes, right? There is some in our coding guidelines also. The external cause status codes, they're not applicable. Remember, we've talked about this before, to those poisoning codes, those adverse effects. And one other thing I want to mention is they're not used to be used for what they call in the coding world misadventures. So misadventures are, in my terms and layman's terms, are medical mistakes. So we don't use them for those medical mistakes or those misadventures or late effects. And guidelines, like I said, if you go back to your guidelines, it's going to tell you that as well. There is another guideline on Y99 that says we do not assign a code from category Y99 if no other external cause codes, like the cause or the activity, are applicable. Okay, so meaning that cause and activity is more that primary external cause, and then these Y99s are even secondary to those, and we'll only apply them when we're able to apply the cause or the activity. So as we just mentioned, that cause and that intent, you know, was kind of took precedence, and here's kind of a slide that shows that as well. So often that cause and that intent is referenced by a single code, but then we have the place of the occurrence, the activity, and then the status of the patient, and those are separate codes. So I love this slide because it really shows you kind of that, you know, the layer or the way that it should be coded and the steps that it should be coded. So really a well-documented case, and I'm sure all of the providers that we work with are the best documenters in the world, and we're thrilled with that. So those well-documented cases could have at least 4 external cause codes. So you can see that the cause and the intent, and then the place, the activity, and the status. If there are multiple causes of injury described by more than one code, each one can be reported, by the way, okay? But I also want to let you know that if your organization limits the number of codes that you can report, and then, or only one external cause code can be reported due to space limitations, because maybe you had, you know, I don't know how many codes, ICD-10 codes, if you're reporting up to those 12s, or if you're reporting less than that. But if you have space limitations, the external cause code most related to your principal diagnosis always should be assigned, okay? Codes for cause and intent, including those medical misadventures, you know, do take precedence over those codes for place, activity, and those patient status codes as well. Let's take a look at an example here. Let me see. Oh, it does. All right. So here we have a patient who is a current Army major who presents to the emergency department with a comminuted fracture of the right femur shaft. He fell in a hole while completing the obstacle course on military training ground. So you can see here, I'm going to bring up some of our codes. So we always have our injury code there, the displaced comminuted fracture. He fell into a hole. We have that W17. We have a Y92. So the W17 is the what, right? The Y92 is the where. The Y93 is how did it happen. And then we have the Y99, which is that who is that patient. So here's an example, pretty simple, example here, but we do have 5 codes as a minimum coming out of there. Alrighty. Oh, wow. Well, that was quick, but Kathy, we have booze benchmark number 3.
Perfect. Okay, the question is, codes for cause and intent take precedence over codes for place, activity, and status. Is that true, false, or you're not sure? So what do you think? Codes for cause and intent take precedence over codes for place, activity, and status. Boy, I just glanced over and we've got 100% of you have already voted. All right, let me close the poll, share the responses. And Karina, 100% of them are saying this is true.
Well, this is the smartest group. That is absolutely correct. Good job, everyone. The coding guidelines do tell us that activity and external cause codes are assigned following all of the what they call the causal or the intent code. So, yep, absolutely right. Good job, everyone. All right, child and adult abuse. There are guidelines out there that direct us in the right place for how to use these codes. The adult and the child abuse, the neglect and maltreatment are classified as assault, okay? So any of the assault codes, they can be used to indicate the external cause of an injury resulting from, and this has to be a confirmed abuse. So for confirmed cases of abuse, neglect, and maltreatment, when the perpetrator is known, then there is a code that we should be using from category Y07, which is perpetrator of maltreatment and neglect. And that code should accompany any other assault codes that would be applicable as well. When the intent of the external cause is unknown or undocumented, it is coding, or it should be coded as an accidental intent. So transport accidents, by the way, are always assumed to be accidental. But if the medical record documentation indicates that the cause is undetermined, then the external cause is coded as an undetermined intent. So in other words, if the intent isn't documented, it's assumed to be accidental. But if the provider cannot determine the intent, then you're going to use an undetermined intent code. And so we try to give you that on this slide, to kind of break it down a little bit more simply. So documentation, is unspecified for that accident, okay? If the documentation says something like they're unsure of it, then we would code it to the undetermined. And if in that documentation it's a confirmed abuse, they're indicating that they've confirmed it or that abuse has occurred, then we will code it to assault. Okay. So let's give you an example on here. I'm trying to think of one that I can throw out here. So if we have a physician that states a child fell out of a second-story window, it would be assumed to be accidental. But now if we have documentation that the physician states that the patient fell out of a second-story window, so that same kiddo fell out of a second-story window, and now there's suspicion for abuse, an undetermined intent code would be assigned. You could use that same scenario, if there was a kiddo that was, or I guess just a patient maybe, that was pushed out of a second-story window. Now that would probably be that confirmed case of an abuse, or assault. So hopefully those are 3 examples that make sense on how to document the accident, the undetermined, and the assault. And I'm going to give you some additional examples here. So we have a woman presents with a right thigh laceration, or a lac, as we would say, from a knife wound. And then you can see here is just laceration. This is still that injury code. And then the W26 code was a contact with knife. Okay. Then we have a woman presenting with the right thigh lac from a knife wound. Now this one was inflicted by her husband. The documentation says unsure of abuse, whether it was abuse or abuse versus an accident. Social worker is going to be following up. So here you still have your same injury code, but notice now your external cause code changes to a Y28 because now we have contact with knife, undetermined intent. Then you have another, so the woman presents with the right thylax, same injury still, and now the documentation says that it was inflicted by her abusive husband. And now you can see how the codes change here as well. We do have an X code by assault. There's your assault by a knife, and then we can apply that Y07 category, indicating it was the husband as the perpetrator. So again, hopefully that brings you full circle and understanding the different types of documentation and how your external cause coding could be changed because of it. Wow, that was quick again. Boost benchmark number 4, Kathy. Wow.
I know. Okay, the question is, if the documentation for the intent is unspecified, it should be coded as accidental, undetermined, or assault. So what do you think? If the documentation for the intent is unspecified, it should be coded as accidental, undetermined, or assault. Okay, Karina, I'm closing the poll. I'm going to share the responses, and we're going to have some discussion here. We've got 60% of the audience is saying it's accidental, but we've got 40% saying it's undetermined.
Oh, good. You know what? And this is a tricky area, so don't feel bad. The correct answer is that it's accident, but let me go back to this slide here. And again, so hopefully this visual can help you here. See if I can get a little pointer. What color do I want? Let's go green. So documentation here, if it's unspecified, so there's nothing mentioned in the documentation, we're going to code it to accident. If the documentation says it's unsure, right? Whoops, I guess green on green isn't the best here, but then we're going to code it as an undetermined. But our polling question said if it's unspecified, what should it be coded as? And so again, if we go back, unspecified, we're going to code it to accident. So hopefully that helps. All right, seriously, my intent is not to make you dizzy going back and forth, but all right. Moving on to sequela. All right, so sequela, these are reported using external cause codes with the 7th character S, so S for sequela. These codes are used with any report of a late effect or a sequela resulting from a previous injury. A sequela external cause code really should never be used with a related current nature, okay, of an injury code. So some do's and some don'ts. Do use the late effect external cause code for subsequent visits when that late effect of that injury is being treated, but do not use the late effect external cause code for subsequent visits for follow-up care of an injury when no late effect of the injury even has been documented. So a couple of do's and don'ts there for you on sequela. Now I'm going to give you an example. Okay, here's an example of applying some sequela codes. So here we have a patient who presents for a scar revision surgery. So she had a scar that she had left over, I guess, from a suicide attempt by cutting her left wrist with a piece of glass last year. So she's in for the scar, so there's your L code. And then you have that it was caused by this laceration, so she's got this sequela from the laceration without a foreign body left in there. So you can see the S61 code. Most importantly, that 7th character is an S. And then you can also give them additional information with the X78 code for that intentional self-harm, again, for sequela. So we're saying, you know, what this really is a clear picture to the payer is that due to, you know, an intentional self-harm of a laceration of her wrist, that a scar is the late effect. So that's a good example. Oops. Sometimes it likes me to forward and sometimes it doesn't. Let's see. There we go. All right. You know, terrorism guidelines, and unfortunately, it seems like, you know, and everything we're reading in the news lately, you know, there was probably a time where we didn't think we would have to, you know, apply these. And now, like I said, as, you know, articles and things that are happening in the country more and more often, there are areas in the country that are using these terrorism codes. So some guidelines here to help you. If and when you were to use the terrorism codes, the cause of injury is really identified by, or I shouldn't say the cause of injury, the terrorism guidelines are used by the FBI sometimes. Is they're one of the organizations that would potentially use this, and several other government agencies as well. When the cause of an injury is identified by the FBI or our federal government as a terrorism attack or as a terrorism event, the first listed external cause code should be a code from this category, the Y38, okay? So definition of terrorism, like I said, that's going to come directly out of our federal government. If they deemed it a terrorism event or a terrorism attack, then that is when we would be using these types of codes. You can use additional codes for those place of occurrence, so those Y92 codes, because we do have that guideline, or not the guideline, but the use additional code that tells us that it wants to know the place of occurrence as well. So hopefully that documentation will support that. More than one Y38 code can be assigned if the injury is a result of more than one mechanism of terrorism. And goodness gracious, I would hope never to see a chart like that. If the cause of the injury is suspected to be the result of a terrorism, then we should not use the Y38. So kind of, you know, follows the same Profi rules that we, you know, follow for all other codes. If it's suspected, then we can't code it. We can only code it when it is truly classified as a terrorism event. There are also, all right. Okay, somehow there it is. Now how do I get there? There we go. Sorry, struggle is real some days. I said that earlier to Kathy, too. Secondary effects of terrorism. There is a code Y38.9 that is terrorism secondary effects. These are for conditions that occur subsequent to the terrorist event. This code really should not be used for conditions that are due to that initial terrorist attack. It is acceptable to assign this code with another Y38 code as well, if it's, you know, appropriate and applicable. Let's give you an example, the sequencing example here. Here we have a patient presenting with a broken left clavicle. As you may know, he was running in the Boston Marathon, which actually did occur several years ago on the street when the Boston bombing took place. He fell into a drain. He is an avid hobby runner. So if you can see some of the codes here, we have obviously the injury code, the S42. The Y38 is the Y. There's your terrorism. And that's going to be your first code based off of coding guidelines. You have the what caused it. He fell into the manhole or that storm drain. There's your W17 code. Where did it take place? There's your Y92 code. How? He was running, the Y93. And then the who is your Y99. So again, you know, what seems like to be a pretty simple example really can produce quite a few codes. All right, and if I think I mentioned these later, but I really want to drive this home because this is where we see errors in audits. So friendly reminder here, do not use your place of occurrence codes, the Y92.9, if the place is not stated in the documentation. And, you know, same with the Y93.9 and the Y99.9. So if there's no mention of place or activity, then we just don't code the Y92, Y93, okay? So we're going to keep that one simple there, not confuse it. We do have other external cause codes at the end of your external cause coding. So there is a really unique code, the Y95 code. We often forget that this one is there for nosocomial conditions. So this code is used as an additional code when the provider documentation indicates that the patient's infection originated during the hospitalization or it was healthcare associated. There is actually a coding clinic on this topic, Coding Clinic 2013, fourth quarter, and then I gave you the page number here as well. They basically asked a question about, the patient that had, let me see, they had severe sepsis without septic shock, they had pneumonia, and then they also came into the hospital and then they had hospital-acquired pneumonia after that, and they basically said, can we still apply the Y95 nosocomial condition for that type of a documented healthcare acquired condition? And Coding Clinic came back and said, yes, you can. So please feel free to go out there and read that. There is another kind of unique code, and that's the Y90. And this is a code that classifies the patient's blood alcohol level. These codes should be used in addition to codes from that category F10. So those F10, alcohol-related disorders. That's when you can go and also apply the blood alcohol level if they give that to you in your documentation. All right, medical misadventures, my favorite. So we talked about what a medical misadventure is. It's really a medical mistake in my mind. Y62 to Y69 allows us to code for those. We've given you some examples here as well. There are excludes 1 and excludes 2 notes with these codes, so make sure that you go out and review them if you're coding from here. I actually could have used this code. I actually had a surgery, or not a surgery, but I had a procedure to actually gave birth to a child 30 plus years ago and had a medical misadventure in doing that, and it was due to failure of sterile precautions. So this is actually a code or a set that I could have used if we would have had them back in the day, and it probably really would have painted a nice clear picture for the payers as to why all the infections and all the icky stuff that I went through for a while. So just kind of pointing out that they're there, don't forget about them. There is also this whole section in the back, Y70 through Y82, that covers topics around medical devices associated with an adverse incident in diagnostic and along with therapeutic use. Now, what's interesting is when you go to this section, each of these category of codes have their own specialty. So, for example, you can find out there's the anesthesiology section, and then it'll have codes for diagnostic and monitoring, therapeutic, prosthetic, surgical instruments, and miscellaneous. And then beyond that, it'll have cardiovascular, and then go down those 5 bullets again with the diagnostic, monitoring, therapeutic, and so on and so forth. So each specialty has its own kind of fun little area specific to them. And again, in the personal experience that I had, that I just shared with you about the whole failure of sterile precautions that were not used on me, I could have had a Y76.3 assigned to my case as well, with the OB section, the surgical instruments and materials. So, just to kind of point out that I personally can see these codes being used on things that I have gone through, so I can believe that they can be used probably more often than what we truly are using them today. All right, Kathy, this is our final booze benchmark.
Perfect. Okay, the question is, an external cause code should be assigned in addition to code T39.1X2A, which is acetaminophen poisoning, intentional self-harm. Is that true, false, or you're unsure? So should we assign an external cause code in addition to code T39.1X2A, which is acetaminophen poisoning, intentional self-harm? So what do you think? True, false, or I don't know? And I've got responses trickling in a little slower, so a little hesitancy here, but oops, looks like we've got everybody. Let me close the poll, share the responses. And Karina, 100% are saying this is false.
Well, that 100% is absolutely correct. So great job, because that actually took us back more than the last 4 slides. But you're right. Per those coding guidelines, that we should not be assigning an external host code from Chapter 20 if we have a code like the one that's given in this example here, if they show the cause and the intent in that combination code. And this code does. It shows the cause, the acetaminophen poisoning, and the intent was the intentional self-harm. So great job, everyone. All right, just a few slides left here before we wrap up. And this is a really good question, again, that Coding Clinic addressed for us. Non-physician documentation. So questions have come up on, because of these external cause codes, and we know that oftentimes that the provider themselves may not give us that depth of information that we want, but sometimes the nurse's notes will get it, or sometimes the ambulance transport notes will have it, or be above and beyond. And so a question really went in on, asking Coding Clinic to clarify whether codes or coders, I should say, must use physician documentation, or if we as coders can use information from non-provider documentation, such as, like I said, those nurses' notes and ambulance transports, or wherever else it might be in that legal medical record, so to make sure that we stay there. And so really Coding Clinic came back and said that, again, the information must be contained in the official legal medical record. Codes for those external causes are assigned based on physician documentation. But then they say, however, if the physician does not document that external cause information, coders may use documentation available from non-physicians. Now, I want to also point out that they go on to say that if there is a conflict between the physician and then a non-physician documentation, the physician's documentation always takes precedence. So again, gave you that Coding Clinic. Feel free to go out and look at it yourself. But it does give us some leeway there to get that full picture if we are going to apply all of the correct codes. And then new in 2018, so 19 days hot off the press since it's October 19th now, there's a few new codes that I just wanted to point out here in your ICD-10-CM. So you do have some new all-terrain ATV codes here. So the V86.25. So a person on outside of 3 or 4 wheel ATV injured in a traffic accident, or there's a new code for V86.26, person outside of the dirt bike or motocross bike injured in a traffic accident. So it's just some fun new codes there. And you know what, Kathy? That wraps it up for this session of our webinar for this month.
Perfect. And right at the top of the hour. So wonderful presentation, Karina. So thank you very much. And I want to thank everybody for joining us for this month's webinar. I do want to mention that if you enjoyed it, please let us know in the survey that you'll get when we close out. And then just so you know, next month on November 14th, we have billing for preventative visits and sick visits for those Profi coders. And on November 28th, we have the shortcut to the OPPS system. So thank you for your time. Let us know what you thought about our webinar, and we hope to see you next month. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Thanks. Bye-bye.